Sarah, thanks so much for joining us today. Can you tell me a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I'm a palliative care specialist social worker and I work in the community and in hospices across London for the last 20 years. And that means I work with patients who are at the end of life, who are dying, and work with their families. So a lot of my work is working with grief and loss.
So we know that bereavement is painful, we know it's difficult. Can you tell me why it's important to prepare for it?
Well, we know from research and studies, but also just from our own experience, that it can help people to talk about grief and loss and bereavement before it happens. And if people have the opportunity to talk about the loss they are experiencing at the time and the loss of a loved one, it can help for their grief to be less painful. We can't take away the pain. Nobody can fix things like that, but we can, by talking about things, just help a little bit to help it be a little bit easier.
And there is something about, as you just said, loss begins before someone dies, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just at the point of death. We're already grieving, we're beginning to grieve, knowing that someone is not going to be with us.
Exactly. As soon as that diagnosis is heard, or somebody has a serious illness, their loss is already happening. And this can be around not just the death of somebody, but around the change in somebody's life, their lifestyle, whether they're working still, how you feel as a couple, how you feel as a parent, how you feel as a friend. Your money income can be different. There are just so many losses because of a palliative diagnosis and because of a pre-bereavement that we're all working with them all the time, not just the patient, but the wider family.
So sometimes in palliative care we hear the term anticipatory grief. What does that actually mean?
Anticipatory grief just means anticipating somebody's death and the grief and loss you'll experience leading up and after. It's also been called in the past pre-bereavement work. Okay. It's the same thing.
Anticipatory or living grief is where someone experiences feelings of loss before a person dies, possibly long before the actual time of death. Health and social care professionals need to be aware of anticipatory grief and alert to situations where it may be affecting people or families in their care. This could be the partner of a person with dementia, the child of someone with a terminal illness, or parents whose child has a life-limiting or life-altering condition, such as a lifelong learning disability. People may experience anticipatory grief in different ways. Some may feel guilty about the way they feel, while others may not recognise they are experiencing a grief response at all. Anticipatory grief can be thought of as a journey. The path someone thought they were on now looks very different, and they must navigate a new and unfamiliar way. This can be a frightening, uncertain, or lonely experience. People may feel grief for the person who's changing in front of them. They may grieve the loss of their own identity, especially if they have taken on a caring role. They may also grieve for the loss of the future they had imagined together, or the hopes and dreams they held for their child. Anticipatory grief may last for many years. Although there may be times of stability where life feels more manageable, events like a change in a person's condition, an admission to hospital, or a move to residential care can reawaken feelings of grief. When supporting someone in this situation, it can be helpful to think of it as accompanying them for a short part of their journey. It can be difficult to know what to say. Saying things like, "At least they're still here," is generally not helpful. Sometimes it's appropriate not to say anything at all, but just be with them, giving them a safe space to talk, cry, or just be. Affirming with people that how they're feeling is a natural response to grief or loss, or simply acknowledging their thoughts and feelings can also be an important first step. People may also appreciate being directed to sources of support. Meeting with others who are going through a similar experience can be a comfort. Finding ways of connecting with a person with dementia through music or by sharing happy memories can be helpful. For parents, making memories with their child and any siblings can be very valuable. Supporting the wider family is also important. Helping relatives feel more prepared and making an anticipatory care plan can help them navigate this time. This can help with some of the fear or uncertainty before and around the time of death. When an adult or child dies after a long illness, a new wave of grief is usually triggered in those close to them. Families say that it can feel as though they lose the person twice. It's important for health and social care teams to recognise this. It's unhelpful to make comments about the death bringing relief. People may be comforted knowing their relative is no longer suffering, but it's still likely to be a very painful time and can come as a shock. Often, a simple acknowledgement of their loss is most appropriate. Experiencing a long period of anticipatory grief doesn't necessarily lessen feelings of grief at the time of death. The sudden loss of a caring role and contact with people such as nurses or carers can also be isolating. Be sensitive about the removal of aids and equipment from their home and ask the family about their wishes. Try to affirm the important role they had in caring for the person who has died. Small acts of sympathy are often important to families. This may be as simple as a letter of condolence or a phone call. A meeting with the healthcare team may also be appropriate, but consider where best to do this. Returning to a hospital or care setting might be a painful experience soon after a person has died. Anticipatory grief can be a long and lonely journey. People might find they come in and out of periods of grief over a sustained period of time. But each person's experience of grief and their response to it will be unique. As health and social care professionals, we have the opportunity to recognise anticipatory grief and come alongside people on this journey to help and support them find their way through.
So in terms of theories and models of grief, I know historically we used to believe that things happened in a sequence. But I know now that there are different models and things have changed and understanding around grief has developed.
Yeah, I think most people have heard of Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages, which came out in the 60s. And that looked at sort of a linear grief pattern. But we know that people don't do things in order of one straight line. People go back and forwards with different feelings. And that's same with anticipatory grief as it is after somebody dies. A lot of the theories talk about people feeling happy and sad.
Right.
So people have hope, but they also have despair. And nobody can feel hopelessness or be upset all the time. It's all right to be happy as well. So some of the models have talked about that. We've also got models like continuing bonds and growing around grief, which are like 2 of my favourite, which talk about how we don't have to get over somebody. We learn to live with our grief. So we grow around. So you can start with grief as like, if you think of it as a black hole, with us about the same size, that hole stays the same, but we grow around it. And we keep that continual bond with the person who we've lost, so that we always remember them, but we grow and we change.
And our life continues after grief.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what are some of the signs that we might look out for when looking after someone who's dying and those who are looking after them?
Well, I think a lot of people experience anxiety. When you're caring for someone or someone you love is seriously ill, it can be a very anxious time. And that anxiety can also lead on to fear as well, because anxiety is a part of being afraid. And also those fears and anxiety, also people can feel anger.
Right.
And they can feel cross with themselves or with their loved ones. And being able to understand that and reassure them is really helpful.
Someone I love died. I've been crying, like, a lot. One day I'm playing basketball, and the next day, it's like everything is different. I don't know, it's hard to explain. But to me, grief just feels like an empty hug.
Sometimes I just don't feel like anyone gets it. Everyone says it's totally normal to have all kinds of thoughts and stuff. To me, grief feels like I'm going to be sad forever. I wonder if anyone else feels this way?
To me, grief feels like my heart hurts.
Like living the worst day, every day.
Like a Harry Potter Dementor.
Like a tornado came and shook up my entire world.
Like eating pizza. I hate pizza, yuck!
Grief feels like a punch in the gut every time I think about it.
Like butterflies in my stomach.
Grief feels like anger.
A bomb about to go off.
Like it's my fault.
Like when you drop your popsicle on the sidewalk.
Sadness and loneliness because I will never have a mother.
A heavy bowling ball in my heart.
A rotten apple.
Sad but angry at myself for not doing anything before he died.
Grief feels like nobody understands.
Like something blocking out the sun.
Grieving can feel different for everyone.
So some of the other things we might see in the people that we're visiting and working with is that sometimes they feel guilty. And this can be because they are anticipating the person's death. Mm-hmm. So before the person's died, they might be thinking about what will happen when they die, planning for what will happen when they die, and that can make people feel very guilty, though it's a natural thing to do. Also, if somebody's having a difficult death, then people can maybe wish that the death would happen. And that can really cause guilt with people. So saying that out loud to a professional, to somebody who isn't emotionally involved and isn't going to get upset, can be really helpful.
And I know that some of the physical effects can be that people don't sleep properly, they get digestive problems, they find it difficult to concentrate. And again, really important, isn't it, to name those things so that we can explain that these are just normal, predictable parts of grieving.
Exactly.
So as a healthcare professional, witnessing what we've just described, what do you think stops us from beginning conversations about death and dying and bereavement?
Yeah, I think it's scary and for the patient and their family, and so it's scary for us as well. And health professionals are often worried about getting something wrong, upsetting someone, making the situation worse. And I think with unsaid conversations, when we're trying to get people to talk about things, we can't make it any worse. We're just trying to get them to talk to us about what's worrying them.
So in my experience, sometimes the anxiety and the fear that people have when they're about to experience loss is sometimes around unsaid conversations, things that they're too afraid to talk about. As a healthcare professional, how might you support someone to begin conversations?
Yeah. I think the most important thing is to ask the questions, to ask, how are you managing? How are you coping? If there's children involved, ask how the children are doing, what's happening for them. If a person starts to feel upset, to reassure them that it's okay to talk to us.
So when we see families afraid, how can we help? What are the ways in which a healthcare professional might be able to support and help when we see fear?
I think maybe a good way of looking at that is to think about a family that I've seen recently and can happen quite a lot in this situation, where people aren't communicating because of the fear. And when sometimes we get asked to see people because they said they're in denial, and that can often be around fear as well. So in this situation, when I visited this family, they were talking about not telling the patient too much and saying that he didn't know that he had end-stage cancer, and if we talked about it, then he would give up. And that was seen as denial and a concern for the family, but we all know that that's fear. They want to protect the person, and that person's probably protecting them as well. So what I was able to do is sit and talk to the couple and just say to him, do you mind me asking what you understand about what's going on at the moment? And that's a much gentler way of asking. And he said, well, and then he looked at his partner and started to well up and so did she. And he said, well, I think I'm dying. And he said it out loud. And that gave her the opportunity to say, I think you are too. And that allows people to start talking.
And people know, don't they? We know that in the vast majority of cases, when someone is dying, they are aware. And yet we often protect the people that we love by not talking about it.
Exactly. It is out of love. Yeah, it's out of protection and love. But it doesn't help that person or anybody involved not to be able to say what they're feeling. And people feel it's very sad, and it is sad. But there is also love and humour, and there is also hope. The hope to have your family around you, for that family want to be with the person as well, to die at home maybe, or in a hospice, but wherever they want to be, and there are things they may have wanted to say, and having those conversations helps people to say what needs to be said and to make plans.
So thinking about when a family or someone is clearly not wanting to deal with what's happening or talk about it, can you suggest some ways in which we might help them to get a bit closer to that?
Yeah, I mean, we also want to be clear that we never want to force people to talk about things. We're trying to help them to start talking about things, and it's still their choice not to. But we could use questions like the what if questions. So If you don't want to, if we're not asking what happens when this person is dying, we can say, what would happen? What if the person became less well? What would you want? What if there's somebody with children? What if you had to go into hospital? What would happen with the children? Who would pick up the children? And then you can start to have conversations.
Imagining a scenario.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I've cared for patients and their families and people feel very sad, they've said that they don't want to go on and that they feel unable to carry on without their loved one. How would you advise us to manage that?
I think sadly that is quite common. We hear that a lot, and I think we need to ask questions to find out what they're feeling. And we know that if somebody is considering suicide, it does not increase the risk at all for us to ask the questions. It doesn't make it any worse, and it doesn't mean that the risk is increased. If we think the person is thinking of harming themselves, then we need to be talking to our managers, getting support, getting permission from the person to talk to their GP, and getting advice and support to help them.
So what would you say is most important for us to remember when beginning a conversation about bereavement?
I think just simply that you can't fix this. You can't make everything better. But what you can do is listen, and you can help that person to talk about the things that are most worrying to them.
So what do we do about all the pain we see in the world? All the pain we feel in our own lives? And why does it seem like our best efforts to help somebody feel better always backfire? I've been studying intense grief and loss, baby death, violent crimes, accidents, suicides, and natural disasters. And I've learned something really interesting. Cheering people up, telling them to be strong and persevere, helping them move on, it doesn't actually work. It's kind of a puzzle. It seems counterintuitive, but the way to help someone feel better is to let them be in pain. This is true for those giant losses and the ordinary, everyday ones. Educator Parker Palmer writes, "The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, exactly as it is." He's talking about acknowledgement here. Acknowledgement is this really amazing multi-tool. It makes things better even when they can't be made right. For example, somebody's struggling. Their baby died, or there's been a bad accident, or their mom got sick, and they're just sad. It's way more helpful to join them in their pain than it is to cheer them up, but here's what we tend to do instead. You have 2 other children, you need to find joy in them. Or, you know what you need? You just need to go out dancing and shake it off. Or, I felt really sad once. Did you try acupuncture? We're not really sure what to do with someone's pain, so we do what we've been taught. We look on the bright side. We try to make people feel better. We give them advice. It's not like this is nefarious. I mean, we try to cheer people up because we think that's our job. We're not supposed to let people stay sad. The problem is, you can't heal somebody's pain by trying to take it away from them. Now, acknowledgement does something different. When a giant hole opens up in someone's life, it's actually much more supportive to acknowledge that hole and let pain exist. It's actually a radical act to let things hurt. It goes against what we've been taught. In order to really support you, I have to acknowledge that things really are as bad as they feel to you. If I try to cheer you up, you end up defending yourself and your feelings. If I give you advice, you feel misunderstood instead of supported. And I don't get what I want either, because I wanted you to feel better. It's pretty rare that you could actually talk somebody out of their pain. Rarely does the admonishment to look on the bright side actually heal things for someone. It just makes them stop telling you about their pain. It's so tempting to try to make things better. When somebody shares something painful, it's much more helpful to say, "I'm sorry that's happening. Do you want to tell me about it?" To be able to say, "This hurts," without being talked out of it, that's what helps. Being heard helps. It seems too simple to be of use, but acknowledgement can be the best medicine we have. It makes things better, even when they can't be made right.
So we've talked a lot about preparing adults for bereavement. What's different when preparing children for bereavement?
Well, I think there are a lot of similarities from what we've talked about earlier, but the main difference is we're often working with the caregiver or the parent or the person closest to the child to help them support the child and for them to start those conversations. Most children won't want to be sitting with a stranger answering questions. They'll feel far more comfortable if they're talking to people they know and they love.
And maybe the timing of when a child might ask a question might not be when a healthcare professional might be there.
Exactly. It's usually when the washing up's being done or you go for a walk or something, not when the healthcare professional's visiting.
I was diagnosed in March of 2021, and the consultant told us, So the consultant told us that they could definitely see that they were pretty sure it was bowel cancer. They could see the tumor on the CT scan. I remember sitting with the consultant, and the first thing you think is, how are you going to tell the kids?
When Matt was first diagnosed with a brain tumour, the children, Josh and Poppy, were 7 and 8. There were two things really that were the biggest priority. One was Matt's treatment plan. Alongside that was obviously Josh and Poppy, and when do we tell them, how do we tell them, and what do we tell them?
First thoughts when we got the diagnosis was for Laura. I was sat holding her hand. And then quite quickly, as well as Laura, you think about the boys. Like most young kids, absolutely doted on their mummy, and just thinking, how on earth are we going to cope with this as a family?
I've just got such a personal vendetta against cancer and what it's taken from us. And it's not going to take my kids' happiness away. I need them to look back at this moment and just know that their daddy loved them and how brave he was, because he just never gave up.
Until you go through it, you just have no idea what is coming your way. And when we met with the Ruth Strauss Foundation, it was a lot about how we relay the information to the girls and not make it scary for them, but make sure they have enough information to understand that this isn't going to go away.
If there's one conversation you want to get right, it is the conversation around telling the children that, the cancer is incurable, is terminal, and that at some point the doctors won't be able to do anything else, and daddy or mummy will die.
Ooh, child, Things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter.
For families that receive this type of diagnosis, I would point them towards the Ruth Strauss Foundation because you get expertise and practical advice that is going to make your journey as reassuring and supported by experts as it possibly can be.
I did the peer support group. I felt I could have talked about anything. It's often just that conversation. You know, you're doing a great job. You're doing everything that your kids need. We're here if you need us.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier.
I think what was really great about the Ruth Strauss Foundation is that they offered the service for partners or husbands or wives of people who have had a diagnosis, because that's more difficult to find, and in some way I think actually Will's in a more difficult position than I am, because at some point I won't be here, but he will be. And so it's about how you cope with that and the long-term effects.
Someday when your head is much lighter.
I know that the kids will get through it. Their life has changed forever, there's no question. But he really wanted us to carry on with our lives, and we have the most amazing memories that, again, we were able to create because the children knew what was happening.
To think there's actually a charity for people going through cancer with young children, I found hugely reassuring.
It has made a massive difference in the worst situation. The support is something that I'll never forget, and I think I'll only really see just how amazing the support has been as the boys grow up. But even now, with everything so raw, I'm so grateful for the support, guidance and reassurance that I've had from the foundation.
So how might you support a caregiver, an adult, to support their child through a loss?
I think we do this just by asking the question, how are the children? How much have you managed to tell them? How are they doing? And that opens up the conversation. And often a lot of reassurance, because parents are often worried and caregivers are worried that they haven't said enough, that they haven't told the children, and often they have. So it's lots of reassurance that they're doing the right thing with some advice. So we need to look at age-related best way of talking to children. And so you may have children who are under 5. They will often be very worried about separation. They need a lot of reassurance. And they may often think that they have a magical thinking where they can, if they wish hard enough, things will get better. Also, they can be very worried about catching it and whether they made it happen. So it's lots of reassurance about it was nobody's fault. So with children who are 6 to sort of pre-teen, there's often, they know a little bit more about health and biology, so they may be more interested in finding out a little bit more about the details of the condition, but they can also still have the same fears about it's in some way it's their fault. So again, lots of reassurance. They're often going to worry a bit more about the practicalities, and routine is really important. So it's things like, will I still be able to go to school? Will I still be living at home? Those sort of things, they need to be really supportive and reassuring. And then with older children who are in their teens to sort of young people age, it can be very difficult to communicate. They're going through a really hard time and they're very worried about relationships and how they'll look in front of others. They may want to protect and help more, but also be struggling with a lot they're going through themselves. So often peer groups and schools can be very helpful as well in those ages.
And considering how much time children are spending in school, is there a role that the schools can be playing here?
Oh, definitely. All the schools we work with are really supportive. We really encourage parents and caregivers to update the school. And what we often hope is the school will have a nominated person who the child can go to if they feel upset. And it does mean that as things change and when the person does die, the school are ready and prepared to support that child after death as well.